Good day, and thank you for joining our broadcast today. We are being joined by a group of people from LinkedIn directly via the private YouTube channel, as well as a number of people that are joining us directly on YouTube. Today's topic is enterprise risk management and getting a return on investment. So that we can get started, let me share my screen and we can take it from there. Okay, so risk-taking creates a return on investment that is more than cash or merely financial returns. Before I get started, let me tell you a little bit about our company, Uvidi Management Group. So Uvidi was formed in 1994 as a management consultancy, helping financial services organizations primarily with problem solving, major program implementation, and largely with operational risk management. So since that time, we've been fortunate to be engaged by a range of different companies, anywhere from 50 people to 100,000 people on 3 continents. Financial services, high tech, most recently fintech, reg tech around regulatory compliance, mining, utilities, as well as professional associations, healthcare, and universities across North America and the Middle East. So typically our engagements with companies are anywhere from 10 weeks to 250 weeks. So we've stayed with our clients for a period of time in many instances. And the reason for that has largely been because we finish what we start, and we stand by the execution that we're involved in, delivering a return on investment that exceeds expectations, and mostly that is because of how we manage the uncertainty and the risks that are often involved. We have trademarked our risk delta system for management, and in developing that system, we have applied what's called first principles thinking, and thereby creating better outcomes by design. I'm not going to get into too much more detail other than to say we have really been sticking with our knitting, if you will, for the last several years, focusing on strategy, risks, change management, and helping organizations with organizational effectiveness. And from here on in, I'm going to just focus on the topic of the day. And so today's objective is to demonstrate how a management methodology for dealing with risk and uncertainty delivers a return on investment that is greater than just numbers or basic financial returns. So to get to that, there's 4 items on the agenda. First is to address the divergent views that exist out there around risk management, and then how value creation is tied to capabilities and risk maturity. And then we'll look at the actual ROI-based system, and then how you can accelerate your ROI by design. Firstly, taking and managing risk from the outset was designed to create value. And most of the time, what management aims to do in organizations is really 4 things: to demonstrate the contributions that risk-taking is making and how managing that contributes to the business. Next, they want to be able to justify budgets, and that is mostly around developing new capabilities. And you'll see why this is such an important item as I move through this. And then to improve operational and strategic effectiveness. Now, over the years, there's been a lot of talk around efficiency. We're not talking about efficiency here. We're talking about effectiveness, which is quite different. It's really about getting the right outcomes. And then finally, management has had the views in most organizations for a lot of years that every individual is a risk owner and a risk manager. Now, to get to those two divergent views, and I point to this very specifically because I teach. And as I teach, one of the things that I find is always an issue is that there are two very different sides to risk-taking in organizations. There's the business side, where it's all forward-looking. It's about, quality processes, good decisions, good planning, and so on. It's about value creation. On the other side of the conversation is the insurance side. And so they have a tendency to be quite a bit backward-looking. They look at historical data, they look at past claims, they look at hazards, they look at records that support what will ultimately be the risk assessment of the company. And that is all about loss prevention. So the fewer claims you have, the better off you're going to be, the better your insurance rates are going to be. And in some areas of industry where insurance premiums are super high, like mining, like aviation, and so on, this is an important consideration. And basically, these two opposing views can actually start to create conflict in an organization in terms of how risk is viewed. And so typically what I've seen over the last many years, why people want to manage risk is reduce the impact of a risk event. And that's where that preserve value, less losses, or to reduce problems or incidents. If we can get ahead of it, then we won't have the problem. And then to make better risk-informed decisions that are defensible. This is much more recent. And so as we work with companies to help them to have the capabilities to better manage risk, to better understand the depth of what is involved, we help to expose them to the things they don't know. And so once they're exposed to that, what happens is they want to know more. They want to have more of these capabilities. But if you want more, then what you've got to do is start to develop some clarity. And it is clarity around where is that value going to be, and how much value you can create is going to depend on the risk maturity. And I'll explain that in a few moments, how that's derived. But also, what are your value drivers? Where are you looking for value in the organization? And there's basically, in current terms, there's basically about 5 different areas. And that is just good management practices. And the other related to good management practices is accountability. In fact, accountability was one of the very first areas that was identified when there was a huge transformation in how risks are being managed going back about 20 years. So it was with reforms in various sectors, including government, including banking, including the healthcare system. Accountability became a really big value driver. The next one is process effectiveness. And we've known about this for many, many years. The more effective your processes are, the better you are at being able to drive value. The thing is, it wasn't really looking at process effectiveness. It was looking at process efficiency. And that's a huge fallacy in how value is driven, because in creating efficiency, there were a number of corners that were being cut. And we're going to look at that as well a little bit later on. So keep that point in mind about process effectiveness and efficiency. The other value driver is, your risk appetite, tolerance, and capacity. Now, some would say that that term is starting to fall out of favor. I quite disagree, because I think an organization has to have absolute clarity around 3 things. What risk do we want to take? How much of that risk do we want to take? And how much capacity do we have in the aggregate for all of the different types of risks? This doesn't get nearly enough attention in a lot of organizations, and we're going to talk about that some more as well. And then early indicators of emerging risk. Again, this is viewed as something fairly recent, something in the last 10 to 15 years, being much more aware of how to look for emerging risk. Why? Because nobody wants to be caught with, didn't we see that coming, right? So having something in place so that you are not blindsided. And finally, agility, stability, and resilience. This has become a really big topic of discussion, particularly in the last likely 5 years, but especially in the last 2 to 3 years. And during this COVID period, a lot of organizations are looking for stability and resilience. How do we stabilize the situation and how do we bounce back to our previous level of performance? So now to move into a little bit of discussion on risk maturity. Now, some of you may be familiar with the different levels of maturity that are out there. Typically, there's about 5 levels. And in the last 15 years, I would say it is a tough go trying to find a company that is operating at above level 2. So what does that mean? Well, level 1 means you got nothing. It means that everything is ad hoc, you're responding in a way that is not really fluid, but it's much more a jerk reaction to an event that happens. Then those who go to level 2, they give it a try, right? So they're in the tryout stages. Those that go to level 3, they now have several areas of the company that have integrated into their business processes the steps for good risk management, for dealing with uncertainty and complexity and so on. And that basically means that you're planning the work and you're working that plan. You're always refining. And this is where the companies that I work with, this is where I find when I can get them up to level 3, this is where the magic starts to happen, because they're now at a point where they're going to get much more clarity on going forward in being able to use measures much, much more effectively. And so what happens at each of these levels is that they develop capabilities. Now, when I talk about capabilities, I'm not talking about just skills. Skills are important. Competence of those skills is very important. But you need to have a combination of the skills that you're competent at. You need to have capacity to be able to do what you need to do. And then you need action. That means you have to have the will to act. So there has to be competence, capacity, and action. If you've only got 2 of those 3, you haven't got all the capabilities in place. And so with refining all of those, you can actually get up to level 4. And so what that means is that you're no longer reliant on a separate risk department for anything else other than accumulating information at an enterprise level. That means you are now at a point where every area of your business is actually able to manage risk quite effectively. Now, in a lot of organizations, risk is really complex. I'm going to simplify that. And that's why, in talking through all of this and the ROI, you'll start to see that it doesn't have to be as complex as it has been made out to be in a lot of organizations. So there's really 2 categories of everyday risks that you need to be on the lookout for. This is what is going to define how to manage the uncertainty of business. You've got 2 categories. High level, you've got your strategic risks. and you got your operational risks. Those, you've also got financial risks, but that is not our topic today. Today, we're talking only about strategic and operational risks. Important to understand, the strategic risks are always going to be outside of the organization. And they are typically the risks that you cannot control. Because they are outside of the organization, you need to be positioned a certain way, and I'll get into that. The operational risks, now that is something you can actually have some control over. So let's look a little bit more at these. So your strategic risks represent, as I said, what you cannot control. Things like the economy, geopolitical landscape, whether it's the domestic landscape or the international landscape, the climate, big topic. You can't control it, but you can do something to have greater awareness of how you're impacting the environment, to be able to influence what to do about the environment, but also to be able to have responses. So what I mean by that, response, you need as an organization to be able to have various tools in place that if you face an event, whether it's something impacting your ESG, the way that you dispose of certain things in your organization. So you need to be able to respond to that. Even regulatory requirements are a big key. And then finally, your reputation. Your reputation, and some people think they can actually control aspects of the reputation. No, you can't. Your reputation is not decided by the company. It's decided by people outside of the company. What you can do is be absolutely aware of what is your reputation in the marketplace, how you as a company can influence that reputation. And if your reputation is harmed in any way, how do you respond to that? As an example, everyone remembers the Tylenol case back in the 80s. There was the Maple Leaf Foods event about 10, 15 years ago. It's how they responded to those events that made a huge impact on how the reputation is perceived. And there are more, but those are 4 of the big ones. Then there's the operational risks. As I said, they're all the internal risks to an organization. One of the biggest contributors to operational risk is the complexity of business. The businesses that we operate in, most organizations are a system of complex parts. For example, you take the energy systems in our utilities, transportation systems, healthcare systems, and so on and so forth. Why complexity is a big deal is because there's a lot of interacting parts. The thing is that they are all non-linear in most instances, probably in 90% of instances, they're not linear. A system, the organizational system, is dynamic, but there's a lot of history behind it. And it's important to be aware of what that history is, and also what that history is going to mean in terms of going forward. The actors and the system, so the people in the system and the system itself, do constrain one another. And that's really important to know. And it's all about the boundaries. And in most instances, you can't predict what, when, and how an event will happen. So if you're in the financial services system, we don't really know when the next rise in interest rates is going to happen and how big it's going to be. We can have a sense for it. If you're in mining, you don't know if there's going to be an earthquake. You don't know if there's going to be a flood. So there are a number of situations that we absolutely, we just can't predict. The thing with operational risks and how circumstances are managed is that a lot of them are going to be impacted by external factors. So that's those strategic risks. So while you can't control them, there will be an impact. Now, Having said all of that and the complexity of business, internal and external, how will you isolate the risks that really, really matter if you're dealing with a universe of risks? And really, have you seen the list of risks in your organization? Is that a universe of risks, or does each and every one of those really matter to what you have to get done today, this week, this month, or what you have to accomplish by the end of the year? So this is an example of one organization's list of risks. They have listed 62. This is a fairly simple one. I've seen some where they have 100 and 200 different classes of risks and even more below that. In most organizations, that is really unmanageable because some of these don't really have anything to do with what you have to get accomplished, the outcomes that you have to achieve. And over time, these can really become distractors to what it is that you have to get done. What I help companies to do is to really get clear with what their objectives are. Focus on the main thing. That's really all that matters. Whether you have to focus on what your main thing is for, again, this week, this month, this quarter, that's where it really all starts. And one of the first things I want to share that we don't generally share publicly, this is what we work with our clients on. So you always hear about risks to objectives, but there is more. There is a lot more. And this is where I find a lot of organizations start to lose their way, lose their focus, and start to have their attention diverted to a lot of things that are not immediately relevant. So you want to start off with those objectives. Let's say you have 3 different objectives, but you really only want to focus on one at a time. You can do this in a spreadsheet. If you've got a different way of doing it, that's fine. But most of the time, this will start with a spreadsheet. So you create your first objective. Now, what will define whether you've achieved that objective or not? Well, it's going to be the outcomes. The outcomes become your KPIs, your key performance indicators. It is what you are going to measure to determine if you have accomplished what you set out to do. And you could possibly have 3 different outcomes that are going to be the defining factors that you've achieved your objective. And this is where it starts to get really clear. So for outcome number 1, what's your strategy? What are you going to define as the how are we going to get this done? Now, if you have 3 different outcomes, you might possibly need 3 different strategies. This is where the clarity has to be absolutely clear. You can't just have one strategy for 3 different outcomes because there are going to be different things that are going to need to be executed. I see this happening in projects all the time. This is why 60 to 75% of projects don't meet their final outcomes, because they haven't broken down the how in sufficient detail. And this is where things start to really fall through the cracks. The last piece of this is what we define as first principles thinking. It's the assumptions that you have to make around each individual strategy and be really, really clear on these. So don't just go with, same old assumptions, something that has been used before. Really challenge the assumptions. And what you're doing is you're not only challenging, but you're actively questioning every assumption that you think you know about any particular given scenario. As you do that, what you find is that you are creating new knowledge and you're actually finding new solutions for how you're going to approach this. So what I see is often happening is the absolute flip side of this with the assumptions is something that I call reasoning by analogy. What it is comparing two different things, right? So if this, then that, or if not this, then that. So what I encourage you is to really think a little bit differently. Don't think about best practices. Think about leading practices. One term we never use is best practices, not when it comes to managing risk or uncertainty, or especially in what we call this as the 4 boxes. So you want to go through this in that very specific order. So what's my objective? What do the outcomes look like, which become your KPIs? What strategy do I have for each and every one of those outcomes? And for each strategy, what assumptions am I making? Now, the next step of this is something that no other system has in place today, certainly not that I've seen, and I've seen many of them, is something that I refer to as the conditions. Now, I put this in the context of a bow tie model. A bow tie model has been around for a lot of years in risk management, and it's an illustration that actually works really well. I've adapted it a little bit for our purposes today so that the ROI aspect becomes clear. So at one end of the bow tie model, you have what I just described as the objective and strategy, those 4 boxes. Next, you need to be able to look at what conditions must exist in order for us to be able to execute the strategy, given the assumptions and given the outcomes that you have to deliver. So what are conditions? Well, conditions are basically what you need from your people, from your processes, from your technologies, from the system as a whole, as an organization and the interacting parts. And what do you need to be aware of outside of the organization, those external factors? So by putting those conditions in writing, what you're doing is you're really defining your criteria for success. You're defining what it's going to take. And in there, you're going to build in a variety of measures. You're going to identify various gaps and patterns. You're going to identify controls. And you're also going to identify what triggers to keep an eye on that are going to cause a shift in those conditions. By going through that process, what you're doing is you're able to identify your emerging risks. And that's what's truly important, so that you're not going to be the one that's going to be blindsided or, up your chain of command or down through your operations and so on. So you want to be very specific on the conditions that must exist, because without the conditions, you just may not be able to produce those outcomes that you're having to produce. Because if there's an event that gets right in the middle of all of this, what you've got now is a problem. And you've got a whole other set of situations that you have to deal with and consequences that you have to deal with and resolve before you can actually get to the outcome that you're intending to achieve, because it is that outcome that is going to deliver you the value. That's the whole point of this. And so having that effective execution of the strategy is where you want your focus to be. So now, no matter how hard you try, if you haven't got those conditions in place, if you're not aware of them, if you don't know what the criteria are, your efforts for managing risk are going to be entirely ineffective. Here's why. The term risk management is actually a fallacy. The real term is conditions management. Because if you have gaps in your conditions, if you are not meeting some of those conditions, you have risk. And that's where all of your risk basically comes from. Now, that defines the top level piece of the business management aspect of things and where risk lives. It's right in here, right? This illustration you're seeing, that's where risk lives. Next, we come to the ROI framework. Now, this framework has been around for quite a while. It is used in over 100 countries around the world. It is published by the ROI Institute. There has been a refresh of this particular framework, recognizing that the world deals with a lot of risk, and risk-taking does create a return on investment, or not even necessarily on investment, but a return on risk-taking. And so they basically have the same framework that I just explained, right? So you start at the top where it says start here. That's your why, right? So it's like your objective. So you have a business objective. You also need to have an ROI objective. So you need to get that initial why. And this is also equal to your first principles thinking, right? If you go back to first principles on what you do, you will get clarity as you go through this. The second step is the business needs, right? So that really addresses what needs to change, what is going to be able to enable any changes, and beyond that, what are the business needs, and why do we have to generate a return on a particular initiative, on even if it's an acquisition, whatever it be. Business needs have to be very much clarified. Performance needs. And this is where you start to identify opportunities. This is where you start to collect data across the organization. You can get some historical data, that's perfectly fine. But from that, you are going to want to project some of your performance needs. If it's been a certain percentage in the past, well, you want to change that in the future. If it's been a certain profit margin in the past, you will want to possibly change that, increase it in the future. Then you get to learning needs. What needs to be done, how it needs to be done. There are going to be knowledge gaps. As we said before, you don't know what you don't know until you are exposed to some new learning, to different ways of thinking. And that first principles thinking that I was mentioning already, that is going to be one way to be able to just go with a completely fresh and different approach, discard what you've done in the past and go with something completely different. Then your preference needs. Different people learn different ways. Different people behave in different ways and implement differently. And so it's really important to know, and this goes right back to the capabilities that you have in the organization. And so once you've started with all of this data collection, what you want to be able to do at this point is you want to be able to align the business and the people in the organization. You want to identify where your gaps are. And this is something that we help organizations do on a continual basis through an assessment. So once we identify, everything that is there, so the start here, we come down to the program. And this is where there's like literally a meeting of the minds between the management system that I just described and the ROI framework that we're looking at here. This is where the two come together. How are we going to do this? And so with your assessment around alignment and where your gaps are, you now start turning up the curve. This is where you get the response, the reaction from the organization, and they are going to help to clarify some of the objectives that have to be met in terms of how people are going to execute this. Then you go up to step 2. This is where you really start to learn about how we're going to apply this. So you've got a vision in mind, you know you've got gaps, you know you have needs. Now you've got to kick that in, is to do the learning, or to get the coaching, or to do that simultaneously. And this is something that we encourage companies to do. Don't send people off on a course. And courses are wonderful, but about 75% of what is learned is lost within the first 3 days. So having the learning on site with a coach, with a teacher, with a trainer on site, so that you can be taken through the process and how you're actually going to apply it. So now you understand the objectives, how are we going to apply all this? You're doing it. And step number 4, now is when you start to have impact, because you're not fumbling through anything. You've got a very smooth process, and you're continuing your execution, you're continuing and so on, and you get to the end. And now you've got your measures, because you've locked everything in at the beginning, or you've revisited, because once you've done your assessment, you maybe have had to revisit some of what was identified in the first place. But you've got a methodology, you've got the tools in place now to be able to do that. And so the reason why the management system that we help companies with, that we implement with them, why it is so aligned with this particular ROI framework is because of the way the system has been designed. It's very fluid, but it also has several repeat places where you're always making sure that you're aligned. So what you see here, this is our trademark risk delta system for management. It was initially for risk management, but so many companies were seeing this and saying, oh, wait a minute, this is way more than just risk management. Yes, it always was. Initially, it worked really well for risk management. For the last several years, however, it has been used for program management. It's been used to set up acquisitions, divestitures of companies, how to integrate various entities together, and so on. And so basically, while we're only addressing a part of this model today, starting with this strategy and direction setting. So once you've set your objectives, you defined your KPIs, you know you're clear on the how, the strategies, you've used first principles thinking to build out your assumptions, then you go on to define what are the conditions and criteria. Against each of those, you must know what your measures are. Then you have to identify, do you have gaps? Do you have repeating patterns that you must interrupt? What vulnerabilities exist? And then you get to your indicators. You have to be able to extract from that what your risk indicators are. And only then can you start to identify the risks. So whether you're doing a business plan, a strategic plan, whatever, this will actually help you with a process to get absolutely clear and consistent with how you can deal with volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, because they are not going away. And so if you can get really consistent, you will have consistent outcomes that you can deliver. And not only that, but you'll also be able to get consistent results. Now, why is this even important? Well, it combines not only management system, provides a return on investment, it also aligns with two of the most important global standards for managing uncertainty. and that's ISO 31000 for risk and COSO 2. COSO 2 is a risk management standard that was initially all focused on controls. You have to control the risk. And by 2017, the thinking around risk management had changed. You'll see change in how people think about risk management. So that COSO 2 is now actually a management system as well. And this is what we have done with this particular system, is we have combined the ISO, the COSO, and the ROI standard, and have simplified it with the key tools that go with all of that to get you started right to where you are continuing your risk management maturity, so that you can go well beyond level 2 and level 3 with an adaptation model, an innovation model, and then sustainability going forward. So everything that I've just said is really how the ROI model aligns with the process to manage risk. So there is a point-for-point alignment between everything I've just indicated. So the payoff needs, the why, matches with the business objectives and strategies. The business needs and impact objectives matches with the business outcomes and KPIs. What impact are you going to have? The performance needs, so that you can implement, because execution of strategy is all dependent on the conditions that you have in place. Learning needs. There are many, many knowledge gaps in organizations, and being able to expose gently what is it we don't know that we don't know becomes really important. And by simply being able to look initially at, through an alignment assessment, a capabilities assessment, what are some of the significant gaps or patterns that you have in the organization, that reveals a lot of truths for an organization that is able to motivate them to start to look at these. And then finally, preference needs. People's inputs, there's going to be different reactions. People learn differently, people implement differently. And that, again, is reflected in the assessment that we're able to do and reveal to organizations in doing this. So is it really that simple? Absolutely, yes and yes. Why? Very simple, because the biggest and most important thing is knowing what you can control and cannot control, and therefore need to be able to respond to, is really number one. There are so many risks that I read about 150 annual reports a year. And one of the biggest things that I see in the disclosures in these annual reports is that most of the risks that are being talked about are risks that companies cannot control. That is, as an investor, that is of very little value to me. Tell me about risks that you can control and what are you doing about it, and how operationally you're going to grow the value of your company, how you're going to deliver value to me as a consumer, how you're going to improve my customer experience. That's what I'm interested in. What are the risks to that? Reacting to a risk becoming an event, it's not helpful. So we want to be able to stop the reaction mode and be able to put people into a responding mode. Being able to respond in a controlled manner with the right resources definitely will yield you the best outcome. And this is what having the right conditions in place means. It simplifies a lot of things. It allows you to go boom, right to where your indications are for why something is off the rails. Because in 9.9 times out of 10 cases that I've looked at, it has been about the conditions. Somebody has cut corners, they've cut staff, they've simplified a process. There's a gap between an automated process and a manual process, and somebody forgot to look at that gap. And then effectiveness and performance are due to the conditions. that exist in an organization. And the one thing I keep reminding organizations about is that the measures are important, but they have to be relevant, they have to be valid, and they have to be real. You have to be able to see them. And so the measures of organizational performance are directly linked to the measures in management effectiveness, including risk management effectiveness. However, there is a caveat here. Be aware of the correlation and the causation between these two. It's important to recognize the difference. So when one of these measures is strong, for example, if you've got really strong measures for organizational performance, and if you've also got really strong measures for management effectiveness, it does not mean that one causes the other. It might just be that they are correlated. So keep that in mind. And there's three different ways that you can look at this. That ERM, risk management effectiveness, is going to contribute to organizational performance. Organizational performance, conversely, is going to impact ERM effectiveness, so risk management. But good management affects both. And so that is really a reflection of the quality of decisions and management processes. So, are you looking for a return on all of your activities? I would venture to say yes. For risk-taking and for any important management process to generate some sort of return, what you need is a strategy. There's always got to be a strategy. And about many studies out there have indicated that about 95% of strategies are ill executed. There's a reason for that. So strategy needs, in order to be effectively executed and to achieve those outcomes that you aim for, whether there's risk or not, you need to be aware of 5 different things. You need to be aware of the culture, and specifically the risk culture, which requires you to have some sort of philosophy around risk. Then needs to be clarity around what are the executives' roles here? Who is engaged, meaning who's going to be accountable for the final outcome. And you need to have relevant data. And data is becoming more and more and more important all the time. Finally, the capabilities that I talked about, they need to be aligned, they need to be adaptable, and they need to be able to respond to your dynamic environment on an ongoing basis. So earlier, I showed you this slide, but there are 2 things that are going to be different in how your strategies are going to support your value drivers, especially how your risk strategy is going to support the value drivers. So good management and accountability is still there. It's absolutely important. But what changes once you start to implement a much more systematic and consistent approach is that now you are moving away from just process effectiveness to organizational effectiveness. What you do is now you sync it up. Everything starts to be really synced up, becomes fluid, becomes measurable. And it's kind of back to you plan the work, you work the plan. And then also you measure the work, you work the measures, right? So you're always fine-tuning and refining. And what you're also doing now is you're calibrating the risk appetite, tolerance, and capacity. And I encourage you to always be looking at what risk, how much risk, and in aggregate, how much capacity as an organization do you have? An aggregation of risk is becoming very, very important as more organizations start to calibrate where the risks are. And of course, you always want to maintain that ability to have early indicators of emerging risk so that you can ultimately have that agility, stability, and resilience as an organization. And that creates great value when you're reporting, but also in how you're delivering services in the marketplace. So in conclusion, you can apply this methodology to raise your ROI, whether you're doing any type or undertaking any kind of risks, or you've got new initiatives, and they can be of many diverse types. And so part of our secret sauce in how we help organizations to implement this methodology is really in 5 different steps. And so this is something that is implemented over time. It is usually done with groups in organizations. There's an element of education. There's an element of review of strategy, clarity, effectiveness, measurement, and so on. And there's a learning process to be able to integrate this. And that means that every person owns the process and is able to work with it. And then the important part is not just to learn and do it once and done. No, it's to know how to sustain it and how to sustain it for the long term. There's a lot of short-term thinking that happens, and that's fine in some instances. But when it comes to managing the business, when it comes to creating value in the business, sustainability is a really big deal. So this is where I want to invite you to look at some options to go forward and to explore this methodology further. It is part of what we do with organizations on an ongoing basis, starting at the most senior levels. We've done this with boards, with executive teams, with junior executive teams, director level, as well as managers, because that's really where the rubber hits the road, if you will. So, you know, I encourage you to explore further and engage to discuss your objectives further for risk-taking and your management processes, not just for risk, but other, whether it's projects, programs, other initiatives. To learn about the value-based assessments that I was talking about, whether you want to assess for alignment or effectiveness or both, they can be done together. We also do assessments for risk maturity, and that really reflects in the effectiveness assessment as well. Learn about, you know, how to look at patterns and gaps in your organization that are affecting your measures and your performance. And just, you know, basically, I invite you to learn more about the options that Uvidi offers clients and how you can integrate that into your processes. And so the ability to be able to really accelerate your ROI, whether you're just implementing capabilities for managing risk or you're wanting to up the ante on your management practices. So at this point, I will open for any questions that you might have. Now, I understand that our audiences on YouTube and LinkedIn are not going to be able to ask questions, but they'll be able to message me, and I'm happy to answer them. Those on the Zoom call, you're open to go ahead and ask any questions that you may have. Feel free to do that. No questions?
Hi, Dragafa, it's JD. I thank you first of all for an excellent webinar. I have one key question. You mentioned that one of the critical things is understanding events that could happen and to not react but respond. But sometimes the low probability, high impact risk events are very difficult to know or find, and namely the canary in the mine syndrome.
Yep.
How do you do that?
Well, the thing is that the low probability, high impact are generally going to be events that come from outside of the organization, unless, you know, you have an employee that, you know, lets loose, mental illness, things like that. The objective, even with high impact, is to have some control over your own response, right? So it's an emotional thing that happens when a high impact event occurs, right? So it's about being able to contain the emotional reaction and go with a response. So knowing what some of those high impact events would be, even though they're super low probability, have a strategy. First and foremost, what are the steps going to be? For example, who knew at Maple Leaf Foods that there was going to be food contamination? Low probability, super high impact. First step, put the CEO in front of the media, control the media. That unto itself became a response and not a reaction, right? A reaction is when you shun the media, when you close the door. That means panic, not a good thing, right? So it's always go with where you can show self-control and not react emotionally.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? We're coming up for time. If you would like to receive a copy of this presentation, or if you'd like to discuss any additional content, my phone number and contact email are on this particular screen. Please feel free to save it. And I will be in touch. And thank you so much for being here. And I look forward to connecting with some of you in the future. Thank you.